This week, we'll be looking at the way Kant frames his project in the Critique of Pure Reason, and we'll be looking at Kant's treatment of space and time. The big picture is that Kant aims to provide an alternative to dogmatism and skepticism by giving an account of how synthetic a priori knowledge is possible. And according to Kant's account, synthetic a priori knowledge is possible because space and time are the forms of our faculty of sensibility. The way Kant frames his project in the A preface of the Critique is by calling metaphysics a battlefield and identifying his chief opponents, the dogmatists, the skeptics, and the physiologists. Kant's idea here is that dogmatists assert metaphysical claims, and that they do so without providing a justification. This leaves it open to the skeptics to simply deny the metaphysical claims, though since the skeptics do so without showing that these metaphysical claims couldn't possibly be justified, this leaves it open for the dogmatists to turn around and reassert those metaphysical claims. Kant's prime example of a dogmatist is Leibniz, and its example of a skeptic is Hume. Kant's third sort of opponent is a physiologist, and the example Kant gives here is Locke. The physiologist identifies the cognitive mechanisms involved in forming metaphysical judgments, but Kant wants to sharply distinguish the question of how it is we come to form a particular judgment and what grounds justify that judgment. So Kant thinks the physiologists provide one sort of account of how we come to make metaphysical judgments, a descriptive account, but Kant wants to provide a normative account. Kant isn't seeking to provide an account of the mechanism by which we form judgments, but the rational grounds that justify our judgments. Kant thinks that if we identify the grounds on which metaphysical judgments are justified, then, once and for all, we can prove which metaphysical judgments we do have a rightful claim to make, and which judgments we do not have a rightful claim to make. Okay, but what are metaphysical judgments? Some examples are every event has a cause, every body is in space and time, and God exists. We don't just want a list of examples. We want to know what makes a metaphysical judgment a metaphysical judgment. Kant provides an account of this in the introduction to the Critique. So here, Kant draws two distinctions among our judgments. The first distinction is between two different sources of our judgments, and the other distinction is between two different sorts of contents of our judgments. So regarding the sources, Kant distinguishes empirical and a priori judgments. Empirical judgments are derived from some particular experience, while a priori judgments are independent of any particular experience. Kant begins the introduction by saying all of our cognition begins with experience as far as time is concerned. So Kant thinks that if I've never had any experiences, then I wouldn't have any cognition whatsoever. So all of our knowledge depends on our having had at least some experience or other. But empirical judgments depend on the particular experiences that I've had. A priori judgments are judgments that would be justified regardless of which experiences I've had. I have to have had some experience in order to have a priori cognition, but it doesn't matter which experiences I've had for my a priori cognition to be justified. As far as the distinction among the contents of our cognition, Kant distinguishes analytic and synthetic judgments, and he gives us three criteria to mark this distinction. First, Kant says that in analytic judgments, the predicate concept is contained in the subject concept. In synthetic judgments, by contrast, the predicate concept is not contained in the subject concept. Second, he says that analytic judgments are true in virtue of the definitions of the terms and the law of identity, or of non-contradiction. Synthetic judgments are not true in virtue of the definitions and the law of non-contradiction. Third, Kant says that analytic judgments just clarify what we already know. They're judgments of clarification, while synthetic judgments are judgments of amplification. Synthetic judgments increase our knowledge. I think it's helpful to consider this chart. So we can see here that analytic a priori judgments are judgments like all bachelors are unmarried, or triangles have three angles. These judgments are analytic because the predicate concepts are contained in the subject concepts. Right, the definition of a triangle is a plane figure having three angles. So the predicate, three angles, is already contained in the subject, triangle. If I were to deny that triangles have three angles, I'd be violating the principle of non-contradiction. All analytic judgments are a priori. I don't need to have experienced any particular bachelor or any particular triangle to know that all bachelors are unmarried, or to know that all triangles have three angles. So there are no empirical analytic judgments. All of our empirical judgments are synthetic. So some examples of synthetic empirical judgments are this book is blue, or the professor of this course is bald. The only way you can know that this book is blue, or that the professor of this course is bald, is to have experienced them. The fourth space on this chart is the synthetic a priori. Now Kant thinks that all mathematical judgments and all judgments in natural science are synthetic a priori judgments. So Kant thinks the judgment, the internal angles of a triangle, sum to 180 degrees, is synthetic a priori. We can see that it's synthetic by noticing that it's not in the definition of a triangle for its internal angles to sum to 180 degrees. As we said before, a triangle is defined as a plane figure with 3 angles. So it isn't true in virtue of the definition of a triangle that its internal angles sum to 180 degrees. Yet, this is something that we know a priori. We can tell that we know this a priori, Kant thinks, because necessity and strict universality are the marks of the a priori. So in the introduction, Kant says that experience teaches us what is, but not what must be, and cannot be otherwise. So I can know by experience that this book is blue, but I could never know by experience that all books are blue, or that books are necessarily blue. Yet I do know that the internal angles of every triangle sum to 180 degrees. So this must be an a priori judgment, because the claim that I'm making outstrips experience. Now Kant thinks that all properly metaphysical judgments are synthetic a priori. Examples are, every event has a cause, all bodies are in space and time, and God exists. Now the question that Kant sets out to answer is, how is synthetic a priori knowledge possible? Kant thinks that dogmatists, like Leibniz, took synthetic a priori propositions for granted without providing a justification for them. And Kant thinks that skeptics, like Hume, denied that we have any synthetic a priori knowledge at all. Now Kant thinks that he has a right to assume that synthetic a priori knowledge is actual, since, Kant thinks, mathematics and natural science contains synthetic a priori knowledge. So in this way, Kant differs from a skeptic like Hume. But Kant doesn't take for granted that our synthetic a priori knowledge is justified, like a dogmatist would, such as Leibniz. Instead, Kant proposes to explain how our synthetic a priori knowledge is justified. Now, Kant articulates his big idea in the B preface of the Critique by comparing his own revolution in metaphysics with Copernicus's revolution in astronomy. Kant's thought is that in the pre-Copernican way of thinking, the apparent motion of the sun around the Earth was explained by the sun's actual movement in an orbit around the Earth. Copernicus's revolutionary hypothesis was that the apparent motion of the sun around the Earth was in fact explained by the Earth's movement around the sun. Now the analogy Kant wants to draw is this. Transcendental realism is the thesis that the objects of our knowledge are what they are, independent of our knowledge, and the way things appear to us has to be explained by the way things independently are. Now Kant's revolutionary hypothesis is to explain why things appear to us the way they do, not in terms of the way the objects independently are, but in terms of the way that our mind is. Kant thinks that the general structure of the objects in the world can be explained by the forms of the mind. Kant acknowledges that from this revolution in our philosophical approach, there emerges what he calls a very strange result. The result is that our cognition can never be of the way things are, independently of the possibility of our cognition of them. Our cognition can never be of things as they are in themselves. Instead, our cognition is limited to appearances. We can have knowledge only of the objects of our possible experience. So this is Kant's thesis of transcendental idealism. It's the thesis that the objects of our possible experience depend on the forms of our minds for their general structure. And as a result, the objects of our possible experience are appearances only, and not mind-independent things in themselves. Now, Kant's Transcendental Aesthetic, the first chapter of his Critique of Pure Reason, provides an argument for transcendental idealism by showing that space and time are the forms of one of our cognitive faculties, our faculty of sensibility. Kant begins his aesthetic by laying out some terminology. Kant defines intuition as a representation that relates immediately to objects. And Kant explains that we acquire intuitions by objects being given to us, and that this occurs insofar as objects affect our mind. This use of the term intuition differs from the way we use it commonly in English today. Kant's German word here is Anschauung. Anschauung is the noun that corresponds to the verb anschauen. Anschauen is a common word meaning to look at. So an Anschauung you could think of as a looking at. This is what an intuition is. It's the immediate presence of an object to our senses. Kant defines sensibility as our capacity to acquire representations by being affected by objects. Sensibility is our capacity of intuitions. And for Kant, sensibility is a receptive capacity, because we have intuitions by objects affecting us, or by our receiving objects. Now, while intuitions relate immediately to objects, concepts, by contrast, are representations that relate to objects by means of intuitions. More specifically, Kant says by means of marks of intuitions. And the understanding Kant defines as our faculty of concepts, or our faculty of thought. He defines sensations as the mere effect of an object on our sensibility. So this implies that intuitions, though they are received by objects affecting our senses, are more than mere effects of objects on our senses. since sensations are the mere effects of objects on our senses. A question that we'll have to answer for ourselves is, what are intuitions, if they are something over and above sensations? Now, Kant draws a contrast between empirical intuitions and pure intuitions. Empirical intuitions are intuitions that relate to objects through sensations, while pure intuitions are intuitions that contain no sensations. Kant will argue in the Aesthetic that space and time are pure intuitions. Kant defines an appearance as the object of an empirical intuition. I think it's important to note that it doesn't follow from Kant's definition of appearance that appearances are anyway mind-dependent, or that there's any sort of distinction between objects as they appear to us and objects as they are in themselves, or between appearances and things in themselves. An appearance is just whatever the object of an empirical intuition is. So if our empirical intuitions are of things in themselves, then appearances are things in themselves. If instead Kant can show us that our empirical intuitions are not of things in themselves, then it'll follow that appearances are not things in themselves. The last key distinction Kant draws in the Aesthetic is between the matter and the form of empirical intuitions. Kant tells us that sensation is the matter of empirical intuitions, while what orders many sensations, or in Kant's terminology, the manifold of sensations amongst one another, is the form of empirical intuitions. Kant will argue that space and time are the forms of empirical intuitions. But Kant lays out three theories of space and time at A23, B37. He writes, "Now, what are space and time? Are they actual entities? Are they only determinations or relations of things, yet ones that would pertain to them even if they were not intuited? Or are they relations that only attach to the form of intuition alone, and thus to the subjective constitution of our mind, without which these predicates could not be ascribed to anything at all?" The first of these three theories, absolutism about space and time, put forward by Isaac Newton. The second theory, relationalism about space and time, defended by Leibniz. Now, Kant will agree with the Leibnizian relationalist that space and time are systems of relations among bodies and events. But Kant disagrees with the Leibnizian relationalist and agrees with the Newtonian absolutist that space and time are prior to the bodies and the events in space and time. The key distinction that Kant wants to draw is that for Newton and for Leibniz, space and time are mind-independent. For Newton, space and time are mind-independent entities, and for Leibniz, space and time are relations among mind-independent entities. For Kant, by contrast, space and time are mind-dependent. Space and time are forms of our capacity for intuition, and bodies and events stand in spatial and temporal relations only in virtue of being objects of our possible, sensible experience. So that's Kant's thesis. Now let's look at his arguments. So the overall structure of Kant's argument is, first, he aims to show that our representations of space and time are a priori. Second, he aims to show that representations of space and time are originally intuitions. Third, he aims to show that representations of space and time could be a priori and originally intuitions, only if space and time themselves are the forms of our sensibility, from which it'll follow that space and time are the forms of our sensibility. Now, the way Kant presents his arguments in the Critique, he treats space and time separately, but he adduces nearly the same arguments in each case. So we'll just look at the argument in the case of space. Here, Kant adduces two considerations to show that a representation of space is a priori, and two considerations to show that a representation of space is originally an intuition. The first consideration Kant adduces in favor of the a priority of a representation of space is as follows. He writes, "In order for certain sensations to be related to something outside me, that is, to something in another place in space from that which I find myself, thus, in order for me to represent them as outside and next to one another, not merely as different, but as in different places, the representation of space must already be their ground." So what does this mean? And in what sense does it show us that a representation of space is a priori? It might seem that what Kant's saying is that in order to represent spatial properties or spatial relations of things, we have to already know what space is. But this claim seems to be a tautology. It would seem to go for every other property of things. Of course, we can't represent something as having a spatial property unless we already know what space is. But just the same, we can't represent something as having a blue property unless we already know what blue is. If Kant's argument is meant to show us that a representation of space is a priori, it would seem to make every representation a priori. What Kant needs to show us is that a representation of spatial properties depends on a representation of space in a way that a representation of color properties doesn't depend on a representation of color. If we look more carefully at the text, I think we can see that Kant is directly contradicting Leibniz's relational theory of space. Recall that on Leibniz's theory, we come to the idea of space by first noticing the distance relations that objects bear to one another. Then by noticing how those distance relations change, we form the idea of a place, or of the same place. And it's out of this notion of the same place that we construct the idea of space as the sum total of all the possible places. Now what Kant's saying in the aesthetic is that we can't identify objects as bearing distance relations to one another unless we actually employ a representation of space. Now here's how that differs from color. Consider, what does it take to recognize that an object is blue, or to identify one object as being bluer than another? For example, do we need to pull out a color wheel and determine where the object falls on the color wheel? Obviously, we don't. Blue is an object that we can directly read off of appearances. But Kant's thought is that space isn't like this. We can't read off of an object's properties where it is in space. We can't read off of two objects' properties what distance relation they bear to one another. Instead, in order to identify an object's spatial property, or various objects' spatial relations, what we need to do is locate those objects in the whole of space. So in this way, a representation of the whole of space makes possible, or grounds, the representation of any particular object having a spatial property, or it grounds the representation of any particular objects bearing a spatial relation to one another. Now, Kant adduces a second consideration in favor of the a priority of a representation of space. He writes, one can never represent that there is no space, though one can very well think that there are no objects to be encountered in it. Now this raises a variety of questions. First, why does Kant give a second consideration in favor of the a priority of a representation of space? Second, Kant phrases his second consideration in terms of what we can represent. He writes, we can never represent that there is no space, though we can think that there are no objects encountered in it. Is this meant to be a claim about what we can imagine? We can't imagine a world without space, but we can imagine a world with empty space? It would be better if Kant's claim had to do with the nature of our representation of space, as opposed to the limits of our imagination. But what is a representation of empty space? How can we tell that it's possible to represent empty space? And what would it even mean to represent that there is no space? Kant claims that we can never represent that there is no space. But what does this mean, and how can we tell? So these are some issues you might want to think about in writing your papers. Let's turn to the second premise from Kant's argument, the premise that a representation of space is originally an intuition. So first, what originally means here is that, while of course we do have a concept of space, and moreover, we have various concepts of different places in space, these concepts couldn't have been our first representation of space. Instead, our first representation of space has to be an intuition, not a concept, and that whatever concepts we have of space must somehow derive from this first intuition of space. Now Kant aims to support this premise by pointing out that a representation of space has two properties that only intuitions have and concepts cannot have. The first property is that space is essentially single, and the second property is that space has infinitely many parts in it. Regarding the singularity of space, Kant explains that there is and can be only one space. Of course, there are many parts of space, but Kant's claim is that space cannot be the simple sum of all of the various parts of space. Instead, the parts of space must be limitations of the one all-encompassing space. Right, so the thought is, the one all-encompassing space precedes all of the various places in it, rather than all of the various places preceding the one all-encompassing space, and the one all-encompassing space being the sum of all of these preceding spaces. In writing your paper, you should think about whether these claims are true, and if so, what makes them true. And moreover, if these claims are true, how does that show us that space is an intuition and not a concept? The second feature of space that Kant points out in order to show us that space is an intuition and not a concept is that space has an infinity of parts in it. Kant's thought here is that concepts could have infinitely many instances under them. So one example here would be the concept of a natural number. There are infinitely many instances of this concept, insofar as there are infinitely many natural numbers. But Kant thinks that space isn't infinite in this way. There aren't infinitely many instances of the concept of space. Instead, Kant thinks there are infinitely many parts in space. If we think about concepts for a minute, Kant thinks that complex concepts have simpler concepts in their definitions. So for example, the concept of a peninsula is defined as a body of land bordered on three sides by water. So within this concept of a peninsula, we have the simpler concepts of a body of land and being bordered on three sides by water. Now, consider, could a concept be infinitely complex? That is, could a concept have infinitely many simpler concepts in it? I think not. Now, Kant's claim is that space is infinitely complex in this sense. There aren't merely infinitely many instances or examples of space, but there are literally infinitely many places in space. Okay, so now the third premise in Kant's argument in the Critique is that if our representations of space and time are a priori and originally intuitions, they must be the forms of our sensibility. Kant explains that intuitions depend on objects being immediately present to us. In empirical intuitions, objects are present to us immediately by affecting our senses. The question is, how could objects be immediately present to us a priori? How could objects be immediately present to our senses other than by affecting our senses? Kant's thought is that the only way an object could be immediately present to us other than by affecting our senses empirically is if it were the form of our faculty of sensibility. If space is the form of our faculty of sensibility, then it's immediately present to our sensibility in the way that intuitions must be, and yet it is a priori, independent of any objects actually affecting our sensibility. Here, then, is a complete overview of Kant's argument in the Critique for the conclusion that space and time are forms of our sensibility. Two conclusions that Kant immediately draws from this result. The conclusions are that space and time are transcendentally ideal, yet empirically real. So first, to understand what these conclusions mean, we have to consider what empirical and transcendental mean in this context. Empirical means having to do with particular mental states, while transcendental means having to do with the general forms of our cognitive faculties. So now Kant has in mind a fourfold distinction between what's empirically ideal and empirically real on the one hand, and between what's transcendentally ideal and transcendentally real on the other. So something is empirically ideal if it is dependent on a particular mental state, while something is empirically real, by contrast, if it's independent of any particular mental state. So for example, my hallucination of a pink elephant is empirically ideal, since as soon as I stop hallucinating, the elephant goes away. By contrast, something's transcendentally ideal if it depends on the general forms of our cognitive faculties, and something is transcendentally real if it's independent of our cognitive faculties altogether. Kant grants that there are transcendentally real things in themselves. Kant's claim is that space and time are transcendentally ideal and empirically real. So this means that space and time are not things or relations among things that are wholly independent of our cognitive faculties. As Kant writes at A26, B42, space represents no property at all of any things in themselves, nor any relation of them to each other. And at A32, B49, time is not something that would subsist for itself or attach to things as an objective determination, and thus remain if one abstracted from all subjective conditions of the intuition of them. Instead, space and time are transcendentally ideal. As Kant writes at A26, B42, space is nothing other than merely the form of all appearances of outer sense. And at A33, B49, time is nothing other than the form of inner sense. But this does not mean that space and time are empirically ideal. Kant explicitly rejects this at B69. Kant explains that while illusions depend on particular mental states, space and time are independent of any particular mental states and depend only on the forms of our cognitive faculties in general. Moreover, for space and time to be empirically real means that all the objects of our public and objective experience are in space and time. So now the question is, how do these conclusions follow from Kant's previous result that space and time are the forms of our faculty of sensibility? It's relatively easy to see how the empirical reality of space and time follows from space and time being the forms of our faculty of sensibility. The argument is that the only way objects can appear to us is by affecting our faculty of sensibility. So since the forms of our faculty of sensibility are space and time, the only way that objects can appear to us is by being in space and time. But it's not so easy to see how Kant's conclusion follows that space and time are transcendentally ideal and not transcendently real. The result is that space and time are the forms of our faculty of sensibility. But what gives Kant the right to claim that space and time are merely the forms of our faculty of sensibility and not also properties or relations among things in themselves? Why couldn't it be both? Why couldn't space and time be forms of our faculty of sensibility and also transcendently real things in themselves, or transcendently real properties or relations among things in themselves? This is called the problem of the neglected alternative. Kant seeks to disprove the Newtonian thesis that space and time are transcendently real things in themselves, as well as the Leibnizian thesis that space and time are a system of relations among transcendently real things in themselves. But Kant seems to have neglected to consider the alternative, that space and time are both forms of our faculty of sensibility and also Newtonian transcendently real things in themselves, or alternatively, Leibnizian systems of relations among transcendently real things in themselves. This is one of the most long-standing and intractable problems in Kant scholarship. Now, in your papers for this week, you should consider either one of two questions. Either consider, does Kant's argument in the aesthetic succeed in proving that space and time are the forms of our faculty of sensibility? If you write about this question, you want to think about whether Kant succeeds in establishing the premises that our representations of space and time are a priori and originally intuitions, that the only way space and time can be a priori and originally intuitions is if space and time are the forms of our faculty of sensibility. The second question you might write about is whether it follows from space and time being our forms of sensibility that space and time are empirically real and yet transcendently ideal. If you write about this question, you want to consider the problem of the neglected alternative. What do you think the best strategy is for defending Kant against this criticism? Admittedly, it seems very unlikely that Kant failed to consider the possibility that space and time are both transcendently ideal and transcendently real. But what you need to do in writing this paper is explain how Kant actually argued against the transcendental reality of space and time. How did Kant intend to exclude the possibility that space and time are both transcendently real and transcendently ideal?